Now I want to introduce our speaker now. We want to welcome Dr. Stephen Fritz. And he's, once again, we had a very similar things we study. Dr. Fritz has been a professor at East Tennessee State University, excuse me, since 1984. And he is a full professor. He studied the Weimar Republic, Nazi Germany, modern Germany. He's written quite a few books on World War II, on the German angle, and many articles on the subject as well. So I think it's important to go over his books just briefly. So he's written a book on Adolf Hitler as a military commander. It's called The First Soldier, Hitler as a Military Commander. He wrote a book called Ostkrieg. There's a German word for us, Ostkrieg, Eastern War, on the Russian front war between the Nazis and the Germans and the Soviets. He also wrote a book called Endkampf, another German word, Endkampf, which is about the last days of the war in Nazi Germany, with the Allied troops coming in and the end of the war and the fighting in the last number of weeks of the war in Germany. But he's here tonight to talk about a book called Front Soldaten. That's the other German word, means front soldiers. And that book is about the common German soldiers. So you're talking about German soldiers, the common German soldiers, mostly about, the privates, the corporals, the enlisted men, sergeants, lieutenants, captains, and up to maybe major. So you're getting to look at the common army, German army soldiers. So now so the Wehrmacht made up most of the German troops, service personnel were in the German army, and that's what his book studies. And now his book has many chapters, including on comradeship and the weather, terrain, all kinds of subjects. But really, he's going to focus tonight on ideology and motivation of the German soldiers in World War II, which is another crucial aspect. And why were they so committed to this war? Why did they fight so long and so hard? What were their, ideology is a big thing, indoctrination, things like that, in the Nazism, why they fought so hard. And so Dr. Fritz is a true expert of that. He served as an example for me in my own study. I cited him in my book and everything, and my dissertation, and he's in my bibliography as well. I personally own all his books except for the newest one on Hitler as a military commander. So I'm very impressed with his books and his knowledge. And so I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Fritz tonight to present to all of us.
You reach the goal at 8 o'clock in the evening, 8 p.m. In fact, I've seen, as I said in my second book, Endkampf was a comparison, was kind of a discussion of the last month or month and a half of the war in northern Bavaria. I've seen American orders which were exactly that way. American units were issued orders in which they were instructed to take this town, but they were to go on this highway, and then they were to turn right at this road, and then they were to go down that road, and then you go over to the left here, and then you do this, and then you do that, and then you finally attack. German orders, by contrast, were almost always just one page. Oftentimes, German orders were just one paragraph. In mission-oriented tactics, your orders are simply, you have to take position B by 8 o'clock at night. That's your goal. Your goal is to take this position by 8 o'clock at night. How you do it is left up to the command, left up to the units involved. And the interesting thing here is this evolves out of, again, World War I, the difficulties of these large armies. And again, you can see the diagram there is in German. But the problem with these huge, large armies of World War I was the loss of control of them. Commanders, if you commanded from the rear, you lost control. So what the Germans learned by the end of World War I was to delegate leadership down into the ranks, delegate leadership down as far as you could delegate leadership down. The implications of this, in fact, for the efficiency and the skill and the resilience of the German army were quite profound, I think, because on the one hand, it meant that you had to devolve responsibility down to the lowest level possible. So as part of that training I was just mentioning in the German army, as part of that training, German officers, junior officers, German junior officers, even German non-commissioned officers were always taught the responsibilities of at least the rank above them, if not two ranks above them. So if you were a lieutenant, you would learn your own responsibilities, but you were also expected to learn the responsibilities of a captain and perhaps even a major. And in these crisis situations, such as December 1941, January 1942, or at Stalingrad, or in the 1941, the summer of 1944, when the German army is suffering grievous defeat either in the east or at Normandy, and German units are being fractured and splintered and split up. It's not uncommon to see captains commanding battalions in the German army. It's not even all that unusual to see a captain temporarily commanding a regiment, for example, because that's what Auftragstaktik means. You have to transfer responsibility down to the lowest possible level. So you have to give responsibility, you have to trust them. The other thing here, the other arrow coming down is again, very profound implication. You have to have men who have an intrinsic motivation rather than an extrinsic motivation. In other words, you have to have men who are intrinsically motivated to do the job, not just motivated because somebody else orders them to, and you may be kind of in a pro forma sort of way try to satisfy the orders. The whole key to Auftragstaktik is you have to have soldiers at the lowest level who have this internal motivation to accomplish the task, and that's the key. I think that's in a sense the hidden secret, the formula that the Germans had hit on, which made the German army so resilient and effective in World War II. The final point here, and getting on, the intrinsic motivation here, to a large extent, my argument was, and still is to a large extent, the intrinsic motivation was this notion of a new society, the Volksgemeinschaft, that the Nazis had socialized average Germans to believe in, to expect, to see being built in front of them, to participate. One of the secrets of National Socialism was this ability to mobilize average Germans and essentially promote the sense, convey the sense that I, as an average citizen, was participating in building this new society. There's also this other factor, though, and it's always kind of looming here, this other factor of ideology, and I could not ignore that. In fact, my third book, you can see, is Ostkrieg, Hitler's War of Extermination in the East. There's this other dimension too. The other dimension, I think, is the ideological dimension. There's no doubt that the German war in the East, Hitler's war in the East, was a war of extermination. It was meant from the beginning to be a war of extermination, both for economic reasons and for racial reasons. Hitler was convinced that Germany had ultimately lost World War I because of lack of resources. The British blockade had burdened the German economy, burdened German civilians. Germany had to have reliable access to resources and foodstuffs in order to become a great power again. In order to become a world power, Germany had to have this so-called Lebensraum, which I'm sure most of you know in German means simply living space. And Hitler meant living space quite literally. Germany had to have territory which would provide the food, the resources, the raw materials for Germany to compete with the Anglo-American global empires. There was a racial dimension here as well, because Nazism was ultimately about racialism. East Central Europe, Eastern Europe, European Russia was populated by alleged inferior populations of Slavs, the Poles, the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, the Russians, and so forth. And of course, there was an extensive Jewish population in East Central Europe as well. So this from the beginning was meant to be a war of extermination. Hitler fully intended, if Germany won the war, and you can see the map down there, if Germany won the war, Hitler fully intended to create a greater Germanic empire, the greater Germanic Reich of the German nation. He meant to create a Germanic empire. And in order to do that, since Hitler always emphasized that you could not Germanize people, you could only Germanize territory. In order to do that, there would have to be large-scale evictions of the inhabitants, of the indigenous population. In the course of this large-scale depopulation of this vast area of East Central Europe and European Russia, Nazi planners estimated, and I am not engaging in hyperbole here, Nazi planners estimated that maybe as many as 30 to 45 million people would die in this. During the course of the war in 1942, 1943, already the Germans tried, 1941, the Nazis tried to begin implementing some of these racial reordering ideas. So-called hunger plan, where they deliberately starved Soviet populations, starved them to death. The so-called General Plan East, Generalplan Ost, which was this great comprehensive redevelopment plan. Millions of Soviet citizens died. Soviet historians of the Soviet Union estimate somewhere around maybe as many as 20 million, some estimates as high as 27 million civilians, Soviet civilians, died in World War II. This was an extraordinarily murderous plan on the part of Hitler. Most Americans are not aware of the extent of the true dimensions of what Hitler had planned here in terms of this war of extermination. We're aware of the Holocaust. And the Holocaust is horrifying enough, with the death of 6 million Jews, roughly 6 million Jews. We're not aware of the fact necessarily that 3.5 million Soviet POWs, Red Army POWs, were deliberately starved to death. We're not aware of these other dimensions of this war of extermination. And the final point of all this was that, as became clear from the letters and diaries and so forth I was looking at, many of these average German soldiers on the Eastern Front willingly participated in this war of extermination. This was not something that was accidental. This was not something that only the SS implemented or tried to implement. This was something that average German soldiers did as well. So finally, what we have here, as I tried to explain them in Front Soldaten and some other works, as to essentially what the ideology and motivation was. The Nazi goal ultimately, when they came to power in Germany, was to essentially set things right from the turmoil, from the turbulence of World War I. Their goal was to set things right and to build a new society. And their promise in the 1930s, after they came to power, and their attempt to realize this, was to create a new modern society, create a sense of community that would eliminate the internal fragmentation, the tensions the conflict, the internal conflict of modern society. So their intent was to create this new society. And my argument was, and still is, that to many Germans, this was in fact a very attractive vision of the future. And it was, in fact, it was so attractive a vision of the future that they willingly overlooked the racist ideological essence. And in other words, many of these average Germans had a self-perception of fighting for the Volksgemeinschaft, but to a large extent, what they meant by the national community was this positive national community of social well-being, economic security, and so forth. But you couldn't separate, at least Hitler with Nazi Germany, you couldn't separate the racist aspects of this Volksgemeinschaft. And so average German soldiers ended up basically fighting in terms of, essentially on behalf of this racist society. As I conclude here, the irony, and you can kind of see the positive sort of optimistic dimension, I suppose, it was the irony of course, after the war, at least in West Germany, democratic West Germany, the irony was that the successive governments in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s in West Germany, until Germany was unified again in 1990, the irony was that in democratic West Germany, what the West German governments did was simply strip out the racist aspects of this idea of Volksgemeinschaft. The successive democratic governments in West Germany simply called it the social market economy. And in West Germany, after the war and up until the present, this promise of opportunity and social integration was stripped of these racist ideological overtones. And to a large extent, the vision of this new community, this new society that the Nazis raised in the 1930s was actually realized in post-World War II Germany by the democratic governments of West Germany. And if you talk to Germans today, if you travel in Germany, talk to Germans today, engage in any sort of political discussion with them, they're very, very proud of their social economy, their social market economy sort of system. So this is something that took root and has persisted into Germany today. And I've taxed your patience enough, and I apologize for going on and on. I meant to be shorter, but I always like to hear the sound of my own voice. So I guess what I should probably do is stop the share here, and then I can turn it back over to Bob and whoever. And then I understand there are probably some questions here that people might have. I'm happy to answer questions here.
Yes. Can everyone hear me? Yes, Dr. Fritz, we have a number of questions from our attendees that they want to ask you, and I'm going to I'll repeat the questions for you and put those forward to you. Okay. I want to thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I never had the opportunity to be a student in one of your classes, but I really like your teaching style and your presentation style, and I really think people learned a lot tonight. So I want to thank you for that. Thank you very much. And so now we have some questions for you. One question relates to I'd like you to talk about the oath that the Wehrmacht soldiers took, not to the nation but to Hitler. And they also ask, on a more personal note, where did you learn German, and did you study in Germany?
Yeah, actually, the first part, the answer is that, yeah, Nazi officers, Nazi soldiers took a personal oath to Hitler, right? For Nazi officers, for German officers, that was not all that unusual. In the old Imperial Army before World War I, German officers took an oath of allegiance to the emperor. So that was not that unusual. So German officers at the end of the war kind of justified their allegiance and cooperation and service to Hitler on the basis of, well, they took a personal oath. Well, that was kind of a self-serving sort of justification. The great majority of Nazi officers supported Hitler and Nazism to a great extent. Where did I learn German? I actually grew up in an area in the southern part of Illinois. I grew up in a very small farm town about 75 miles east of St. Louis. And if some of you know German immigration, that was a heavily German area. So I grew up in an area which was not all that dissimilar from the Pennsylvania Dutch country around your area there. So I'm old enough, I can still remember back in the 50s and 60s when I was a kid out in the farm areas, the farmers still spoke German amongst themselves. It was a god-awful dialect of German, but they spoke German amongst themselves. There were still German language schools out in the rural areas. There were German language churches. I had a smattering of German in college. I studied in Germany. I did indeed study in Germany. I had German instruction. I had intensive German instruction studying in Germany. And then over the years, I've been fortunate enough to travel to Germany quite frequently. In fact, for about 20 years, a colleague of mine and I, virtually every summer, every other summer, we took things are popping up here. I'm having trouble seeing people now. So the for about 20 years, we regularly took student groups to Germany for a summer in Germany. So just living in Germany for 6 or 7 weeks every summer, I picked up German. So when I'm in Germany now, most Germans can't figure me out when I go to Germany, because I start speaking German and I don't have a distinctive dialect. I speak a little bit of Hochdeutsch, that is kind of standard German. I speak a little bit of Bayerisch, Bavarian German. I speak a little bit of Fränkisch, which is Franconian German. So I speak kind of this mishmash of what the Germans would call a Gemisch. I speak a Gemisch of German. So when they find out, and it's always kind of interesting, and I'll tell you a story. A couple of years ago, my wife and I were in, of all places, Florence, Italy, and we were walking up the heights, the hills above Florence, to get the beautiful view that all tourists want to see. We were too dumb to take the bus. We decided we'd walk up. So we're about halfway up, and we're looking at a map, and I see over out of the corner of my eyes a school group, and I could hear they're speaking German. And then this young woman comes up, and she sees we have a map, and she walks up and she says in English, "Do you speak German or English?" And so I reply in German, "Well, yeah, I speak either one. Either one's fine with me." And so we start conversing in German, and after a few minutes, she stops and calls all of her students over, and she says in German, she says, and first of all, she asked me where I'm from, and I said, "Well, I'm from the United States." And she says, "No, you can't be from the United States." And I said, "No, I'm an American. I'm from the United States." And then she stops and she calls her entire school group over, about 20 kids, and she says, "Look, here's an American who can speak German." And they're all crowding around me, like they're touching me, like, wow, an American who can actually speak German. So yeah, anyway, that's kind of a silly example, but that's where my German comes from. So
as long as you weren't speaking Amish to them, because I talked to some Germans before, they cannot understand the Amish dialect here in Pennsylvania, so they were at a loss to understand that, even though it's supposed to be German or related to German.
yeah.
Okay, so now to the next question. There's a question about the so-called the stab in the back legend, which I'm sure you're obviously familiar with,
Yeah.
and also the whole idea of the Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy or enemy of the against Nazi Germany. They wanted you to maybe touch on that for a few minutes.
Yeah, that was part of that confusion following the end of World War I. And it was for average Germans, this was a very it was a very difficult situation to understand. How can you comprehend that you evidently are on the verge of victory and then suddenly you're defeated? And there was this sense that, as I said, that there was this kind of pervasive sense that the German army had not been defeated, because after all, the German army was everywhere, as I said, on still occupying enemy territory. And so it was fairly easy, especially in order to kind of maintain, let me back up here. As part of the armistice, the British and French demanded that German forces evacuate, especially occupied French territory, within about a month or a month and a half of the date the armistice was signed. So German forces were hastily marched back into Germany. For the most part, in good formation, they were marched back into Germany. The imperial government had collapsed, the monarchy had collapsed, the Kaiser had abdicated. In the interim, there was a socialist government that had taken power as a temporary government, as a provisional government. The socialists, quite frankly, were not exactly certain how they would be regarded by these returning soldiers, because since at least the summer of 1917, the Socialist Party had been pushing for a negotiated end to the war, and had resisted fighting to the bitter end. So in order to try to, I don't know, I suppose we'd say make amends, throw an olive branch out to the returning soldiers, maybe make some sort of contact with them. As the returning soldiers were coming back, many of these prominent socialist leaders and government leaders would go out and greet the soldiers, and they would greet them with a standard formula. Essentially, we greet our returning heroes, our returning soldiers who were undefeated on the field of battle. And they meant it simply as kind of those nice words. We understand your suffering, we understand your sacrifice. And so as a politician, you say, you were undefeated in the field of battle, and we welcome you back to Germany. Well, the trouble was with that phrase, undefeated on the field of battle. As average Germans began to think to themselves, what did undefeated on the field of battle mean? What it meant to them was exactly that, undefeated in the field of battle. So what explains the German defeat then? Well, it was easy to replace military defeat on the battlefield. It was easy to replace that with revolutionary events. The German monarchy had collapsed. The German political system had collapsed. There were revolutionary upheavals throughout Germany. There had been just a year or two earlier, there had been the communist revolution in Russia. There were communist revolutions breaking out throughout East Central Europe. There were communist uprisings in Munich, for example, in Bavaria. So it was very easy for especially rightist, kind of extreme nationalist conservative elements to begin propagating the idea that, well, the German military was never defeated on the field of battle. It was the so-called November criminals. It was the communists. It was the socialists. And of course, then it was the so-called Jewish profiteers, war profiteers, who were responsible for undermining the German war effort. Hitler certainly utilized the stab in the back theory, but Hitler actually believed it, and as did most top Nazis. So this was not simply something that the Nazis used in an opportunistic fashion. They actually believed in the stab in the back theory. That's one of the reasons why Hitler wanted to build this new society, so it would be resilient and it would be cohesive. So in Hitler's ideology, in Hitler's mind, you have this so-called destructive Jewish conspiracy. As part of the so-called Jewish conspiracy, you have on the one hand communism, which Hitler associated with Judaism, and on the other hand, you have international finance based in London and Wall Street, which was also ostensibly part of this alleged Jewish conspiracy. So uh, the idea of a stab in the back had a good deal of explanatory power in Germany. And for unfortunately, for millions of average Germans who were genuinely puzzled as to how and why Germany had lost the war, Hitler had a ready answer. It wasn't your fault. It was the fault of these insidious forces, that these so-called November criminals.
Thank you very much. And then we have some more questions. This is more relating to your first few slides, Dr. Fritz, Stephen, as far as did the U.S. Army modify any of its training or leadership due to what Shields and Janovitz, Najej, or von Creveld learned? Relating to those different studies about, primary motivation and primary groups and motivation and things like that.
Yeah, the short answer is yes. The longer answer is, interestingly enough, immediately at the end of the war, the U.S. Army, which had a very extensive historical division, which obviously part of it is based up there in Carlisle, Pennsylvania.
Yes.
The U.S. Army has had a very extensive historical division. They went to work immediately trying to discern the lessons of why the German army had been so effective and so efficient. And what they found out, and I don't want to say this is serendipitous, but at the end of the war, large numbers of high-ranking German officers had seen to it that rather than be taken prisoner by the Soviets, they had seen to it that they were taken prisoner by the Americans and the English. So at the end of the war, we found ourselves, the United States and the Brits too, we found ourselves now in possession. We had in captivity hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of high-ranking German officers. And so we couldn't think what to do with them. So somebody came up with a bright idea, and it seems to have been the former German chief of the general staff, Franz Halder. He came up with the idea. He suggested to American officials that the United States put these German generals to work writing history. What better primary source to write the history of World War II, of these different military campaigns, and to study the lessons and to transmit the lessons that the Germans had learned, but the German generals themselves. So we started this massive military project. By the time it starts, about 1946, 1947, of course, we're into the early stages of the Cold War. And so many leading American military officials are assuming that there might very well be a World War III here pretty soon. And the World War III is going to be against the Soviet Union. And lo and behold, we have right in our captivity, we have a bunch of experts on fighting the Red Army. So we put these German generals to work writing the lessons. You can find this now. There's, in fact, many of the records are, I think, probably at some of the military history, U.S. Army military history facilities. But there's like a 24-volume series, publication series called World War II German Military Studies, which are just study after study after study done by high-ranking German officers, the great majority of them dealing with the Eastern Front, with Auftragstaktik, the German methods of training, all of the rest. The U.S. Army took this to heart, and we began to redefine our military doctrine, our what do they call it? I'm trying to remember the acronym now, but they began to revise American procedures on training, on how you develop officers, how you conduct battles, all based on the German experience of World War II. What happens, interestingly enough, is about a 2 or 3 decade interregnum, because whereas American military officials expect that we're going to have to fight another kind of conventional World War II type war against the Soviets, we end up fighting, first of all, we end up fighting these frustrating wars of containment in Korea, in Vietnam. Then we end up, in these little kind of conflicts in the Middle East and all of the rest. So the U.S. Army has to readapt its style on the run, even as they continually are focusing on implementing the lessons they've learned from the Germans. They finally get to implement the lessons they've learned from the Germans, and they do it in 1991, 92, Operation Desert Storm. Operation Desert Storm was planned and conceived and implemented finally after 3 decades. The U.S. Army finally got to implement the lessons they had learned from the Germans, and it was Operation Desert Storm. Yeah. And in fact, some of you probably know the whole concept now that developed in the U.S. Army is that concept of, they call it air-land battle. So all American military concepts are focused around the doctrine of fighting an air-land battle, which is essentially blitzkrieg. Another word for blitzkrieg, but that's basically it.
Okay, and Dr. Fritz, we have a few more questions, but in the interest of time, maybe a few-minute response for each one. Maybe we'll try to cover those.
I get too away.
This next one should only be very brief, probably answer. It's just how did the Nazi regime fund the large list of social programs that they implemented?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you, Chris. How did
the Nazi government fund the large list of social programs during the 30s and the 40s?
In the 30s, they largely funded it through deficit spending, and in the 40s, they largely funded it through deficit spending and plundering occupied Europe. So that's the short answer. I mean, I can give you extensive examples of plundering occupied Europe, but you probably don't want to hear the extensive examples of plundering occupied Europe.
And just a real quick question also about German soldiers who lived abroad, like in America, and later returned to Germany. Any reasons why they went back, or any regrets for coming to America to study, or things like that they had? Or
yeah, that's a good question. Some of it, and again, I have an example I can give you. My father was in the Navy in World War II, and he was in the Mediterranean. He participated in the invasion of southern France, and he commanded a landing ship infantry. And after the invasion of southern France, his job was to ferry German prisoners of war back to Corsica. On one of these trips back to Corsica, he was up on deck early in the morning, and he spotted a German officer up on the bow of his ship. So he went up to the German officer and in English, of course, said, "I'm sorry, you can't be here. You have to be down below." And the German officer, in perfect Midwestern English, said, "Oh, but it's such a lovely morning and it's very stuffy down below, and I thought I'd come up and take a walk." So my father, of course, he's astounded. My father asked, "Well, where did you learn English?" And the guy says, "Well, I'm from Cleveland." He was one of these guys who went back. He went back in August 1939 to visit his grandparents, and the war broke out. And he was drafted into the German army. And as he told my father, he spent the next 4 years looking for the first American he could find to surrender to. And he finally found one in southern France. Yeah, most of the Germans who went back, they went back on the trips to see family, and maybe family emergencies, maybe vacations. There were some who felt the call of the fatherland perhaps and went back to fight. But the great majority of them were simply kind of accidental, I think you would say, and that would be that.
Very good. And just the last two questions here should be very quick to answer, I think. Number one was the real quick one was the German soldier on the cover of your book ever ID'd formally? And another other question was on the leadership principle in the German military, how that applied.
The first question, yeah, actually, in fact, I know who the soldier was, and I've got some actual biographical information on him. He actually lived to be like 90 some years old. Amazingly enough, but yeah, he was actually, and it's always kind of an embarrassment to admit this, since I was writing about the average German soldier, but he was actually in the SS. So I will spill my little secret here and and let all of you in on that. Yeah, and the second question I didn't hear, Chris.
Yes, you know how relating to German study of the government like Hitler, the so-called Führer principle or leadership principle. We have a viewer here who wants to know how that leadership principle applied to the German army and soldiers, if at all.
Yeah, that would be part of that. That would be part of that notion of Auftragstaktik and learning the skills and the responsibilities and the job above you. The whole notion of the leadership principle was essentially, very simply, it's careers open to talent, positions are gained based on social mobility and talent. So the whole idea was the whole basic notion of Auftragstaktik was to train individuals, encourage them to take initiative, and then basically let them rise as far as they could go on their talent. So that's how the principle would apply there.
Well, thanks very much. We have the last comment by somebody here was, thank you for a very interesting presentation. Thanks very much. And I agree with that comment. So thanks very much for presenting for us tonight. And I'll turn it back over to Bob then.
I just want to thank everybody for tuning in here, and I hope I didn't drag on too long in the presentation. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk to all of you, and because I know people who are interested in World War II are very, very interested in World War II, and I'm coming from a different perspective, from the German perspective. So I appreciate your indulgence and your willingness to listen to me here.
Dr. Fritz, we don't pay our speakers.
That's about what I'm worth.
Well, but we do give you a one-of-a-kind World War II Roundtable mug, which I will send to you if you send me your address.
Okay.
I'll send you an email. That will be in the mail to you. They're collector's items. There's only about 500 of them in circulation. So,
I appreciate that. I'll use that in my classes now.
Okay.
I'll publicize you.
Well, that would be wonderful. Thank you. It was very interesting. One final thing. Let me go back to shared screen here. I was putting in a plug for the Virtual Helmet Committee. Contributions are always welcome. And last but not least, a reminder, next month's meeting on Thursday, May the 6th at 7 p.m. As was mentioned earlier by Chris, our speaker is Alex Kershaw, and his topic is The Liberator, his new book about the U.S. Army World War II officer Felix Sparks and the men of the United States 45th Infantry Division. And there you see a picture of our author and a picture of his book. And for those of you that are not readers, it has been made into a mini series on Netflix, so you'll be able to stream it. So again, Stephen, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure having you. If you ever get to Central Pennsylvania, give us a call. We'll take you out to dinner.
That's great. And in fact, the best apple pie I've ever had in my life was up around Lancaster. So yeah, I love that area up there.
All right.
Thank you.
Good. It'll be great to have you with us. All right. Thank you, one and all. And we hope to see everybody here next month. And good
Thanks.
night. Good night.